little girl, I grew up, I wrote an article years ago about called Two Faces. And Two Faces was my biological father was actually murdered when I was 5 years old. But I still remember the abuse he infliged on my mother. And I remember some of the horrible stories that happened. About a year, 2 years later, my mother met my new, who I say in the article, my new daddy. In the 40 plus, nearly 40 years, my mother eventually passed away from lung cancer. They were almost married nearly 40 years before she passed away. In the near 40 years that they were married, my new daddy versus my previous biological daddy, never once did I ever hear my new daddy raise his voice to my mother, let alone his hand, right? So here's a child growing up with two versions, right? But
Right.
here's the thing, when my mother started dating him and he made it known, she had 5 children. I said, any man that married a woman with 5 children and raise them as his own has to be a good man in many
Yes.
ways, right? And my mother said to him, and I wrote about it in Color Me Butterfly. She said, I cannot and I will not tolerate you hurting me in any kind of way. So if that is your intent, I'd rather be without a man. I'll
Yes.
raise my kids on my own. She set her boundaries going into that relationship, right? And he
Yeah.
never, ever put his hands on my mother. You have to set boundaries. And I don't mean just physical abusive boundaries. What are your boundaries in terms, if you enjoy a lot of women, for example, and I want to respect that men are abused as well. I'm not making this just about a women's issue, but a lot of women give up when they get into a relationship, things they love, because maybe the person doesn't enjoy it as much with them. And that's okay. If they don't enjoy it, they don't have to go with you. It is abusive when they try to isolate you from your friends and family and the things you enjoy, right? So
Right.
going into any relationship, or if you're in a relationship, start to create some boundaries, right? And it might start small. And especially if you're in an abusive relationship, I want to be very careful with this, because when you're in an abusive relationship, you have to be careful, especially if this person is harmful in a way that can physically harm you. And most women, I will say, are killed